All right, and here we are. I hope you can all hear me. I'm pretty sure you can see me, at least. Everything I have right here on my desk tells me that you should be able to see me. So let me just check if the microphone is working. Yes, there is something going on. So every time you see me looking into this direction, I'm just checking if all my technical equipment is working, whether I'm still live streaming or whether anything has sort of stopped working during the time I've been kind of sitting here. Also, the chat is over there, so there's that. So for everyone who is watching and who's joining during this particular time, it's great to have you here. Sorry that it's going to be in this format. I didn't plan for it. I was actually planning for, doing hybrid and then not teaching from home, but, the plague happened and then this happened. So here we are, doing that a bit differently. Maybe just a brief comment, because, generally live streaming for gamers works pretty well because people are engaged in the chat and kind of do that and sort of talk or at least communicate with the person sitting in front of the camera. So this is how we're going to do it. I mean, it's definitely not as interesting as a game live stream, but generally this is how I'm trying to do it. So if there's anything, any comment, any question, anything concerning whatever I'm going to talk about, please feel free to put it in the chat. For those of you who are joining later or who are watching this seminar live stream, after the fact, that or after the seminar is done. If you have any questions, then please not lose the comment section, but use the comment section. Oh wow, this is going to go particularly well this morning. Yes, but please use the comment section down below to this is going to go really well to ask any of your questions, and I'm going to go through the comments eventually and going to answer them one by one. Okay, before we start, are there any questions we should talk about beforehand, or should I just go? I'm just going to check briefly how many people are. Okay, 11 people, that's totally fine. So most of you will potentially join later or watch this after I have done teaching. Also, if you hear any weird noises from the background, as I said, I'm teaching from home, so this is going to be fun. I wanted to make a very bad joke about Foucault and the plague towns, but I'm not going to go, and I'm not going to say that, right? I'm so sorry. I'm not going to say any on that. But okay, let's get started. I think the last thing we sort of left off with last week was a very long, which was a very productive, but a very long discussion round on matters of national identity and British and Englishness, and I showed you the clips from the Olympic Games of 2012, the opening of the Olympic Games, and then the live stream got kind of not cancelled, but there was a copyright right Beschwerde from the International Olympic Committee, so yay, I never managed that. Anyways, but that was sort of what we left off. I showed you the clips. We discussed whether you could see more of an English identity or more of a British identity. And the consensus was that we saw kind of both. So there were parts which were definitely English with the countryside, although some of you said it was mostly Welsh, depending kind of where you'd been in Britain already. But generally, we kind of agreed that it was kind of British, but also kind of English. So they tried to make it very British by including Wales, by including Ireland and Scotland and sort of the anthems in the beginning. But it was also pretty English because of the Queen, of the literary canon that was sort of used in order to on the one hand, sort of to make the NHS or to kind of round it up, we had comments or basically quotes by Shakespeare, and we had English actors mostly. That was Kenneth Branagh, who we could see. We had a very clear class distinction, and so on and so forth. So we basically left off with the question, well, what could we see? Was it Englishness? Was it Britishness? And the consensus again was a bit a bit of both, really. And this sort of points us to the fact that it's pretty hard, actually, to distinguish between Englishness and Britishness. While we use those terms kind of interchangeably, it is exactly that what makes it problematic, that we're using them interchangeably. We don't have any real clear-cut lines where we could say, this is definitely English or this is definitely British. And Englishness and Britishness have become some kind of hold-all term, a metonymy for both. So Englishness has become a metonymy for Britishness and vice versa. And of course, the Union Jack and the monarchy and all of these things are certainly British, but they also sort of are tied to very English ideas. They are tied to English places. Maybe not so much the Union Jack, but certainly the monarchy. So often there is this idea that the Queen is actually not a British Queen, but certainly an English one. So there is a bit of confusion where we could draw the lines. And this is something we see, not just we see, but that, the British Committee obviously approved something that was so weirdly indistinguishable, already shows us that it is not only hard for us to distinguish, what is Englishness and what is Britishness, but the same goes kind of for the people living there. And this is sort of shown by a speech that David Cameron gave a couple of years ago when he talked about, British values and English values. And he noted that we need to be far more muscular in promoting British values and the institutions that uphold them. A genuinely liberal country believes in certain values, actively promotes them, and says to its citizens, this is what defines us as a society. I want to use this anniversary as an opportunity for every child to learn about the Magna Carta, for towns to commemorate it, for events to celebrate it. Now, I'm pretty sure that most of you should and do know what the Magna Carta is. For those of you that don't, that is simply, it was signed by King John in 1215, and it sort of regulates and narrows down the power of the king. So the Magna Carta is basically the document that makes the British, or that turns the British monarchy into a parliamentary monarchy. So the king can't rule alone. It's not an absolutist kind of state, but you always have to have the parliament, which acts as a checks and balances, or has a checks and balances function. And the Magna Carta is actually a pretty interesting document. And in this case, it is even more interesting if we look at it from a Englishness, Britishness kind of perspective, because the Magna Carta is very much, again, a classicist or an elitist kind of document. It was signed by upper classes, by the aristocracy and the monarchy. And it wasn't so much something that, people really felt in that moment. Also, it is very much based on the monarchy. It's very much based on tradition. And it connotes a form of Britain and a form of England, or a history of it, that is tied to imperialism, that is tied to aristocracy, that is tied to sort of upper classes and the church. And generally, people that have been very critical about this speech and the Magna Carta have noted that basically this promotes a very Tory view of history, where basically the British are this benevolent ruler, and that can, who can grant generosity and is very generous in general. That's a lot of general in that sentence, but this is sort of the criticism that has been leveled at the Magna Carta, and that has been sort of leveled at this speech by David Cameron, that it promotes a very particular kind of England and a very particular kind of Britain that isn't really inclusive to all. Also, mostly the Magna Carta has been seen as a mostly English sort of document, because, again, it is 1215. The Magna Carta comes right at the point where England is still kind of only England. So there hadn't been any acts of union with Wales. There have been no acts of union with Ireland or Scotland. England is still very much only England. So using the Magna Carta in order to, as he says, promote British values is very strange, because it is first and foremost an English document and not so much a British document. And in fact, apart from regulating sort of the monarchy in this case, it is very much doubtable whether it has any sort of impact mostly on the sort of on Britain in general, if we look at Britain from a sort of state-nation kind of perspective. So it was very much concerned with the English monarchy, it was very much concerned with the English nobility and not so much the British nobility. But this quote, in a way, shows the confusion between English and British. So there is no clear-cut differentiation. There is no point where people say, that this is where Britain starts and this is where England ends, right? So this makes it a bit of a collective problem to define it. And why this is the case, we'll get to in a moment. So looking at the Olympic Games, at the Magna Carta, etc., it is pretty clear that there exists very much a confusion about what is what and how to define England as separate from Britain and how to define Britain as separate from England. This is in a way a historical problem, but this is also a problem that we still see nowadays. So this is something that hasn't really changed. And this confusion is further sort of shown or emphasized by the following quote, that goes into this very same direction of this sort of confusion between English and Britishness. As Fowler writes, but it must be remembered that no Englishman calls himself a Briton without a sneaking sense of the ludicrous, or hears himself referred to as a Britisher without squirming. How should an Englishman utter the words Great Britain with the glow of emotion that goes for him with England? His sovereign may be Her Britannic Majesty to outsiders, but to him it's the Queen of England. He talks the English language. He has taught or has been taught English history as one continuous tale from Alfred to his own day. He has heard of the word of an Englishman and aspires to be an English gentleman. And he knows that England expects every man to do his duty. In the word England, not in Britain, all these things are implicit. It is unreasonable to ask 40 million of people to refrain from the use of the only names that are in tune with patriotic emotion, or to make them stop and think whether they mean their country in a narrower or in a wider sense each time they name it. So not only does that quote point out the confusion, but it also points out what we talked about last week, namely that nation states, or that this sort of emotional quality of a nation builds collective identities in a much more profound and significant way than, for instance, collective identities that are built on civic duties and on political or economic bases. So this is where Fowler already points out the differentiation. England is very much just like Scotland or Scottishness, Wales and Welshness, and Ireland and Irishness. These are very much nation states in the sense of they have a common heritage, they have a common language, they are united by this common blood. So England holds the law of the blood, so to speak, while Britain doesn't. Although it does have a history and it does have a common language, what is most important is that it was based first and foremost on economic questions. Britain does not more or less does not simply appear out of nowhere, but it appears because of sort of the colonial enterprise. They needed a legitimization. And this is exactly where Britain comes in. So Britain doesn't have the same emotional and emotive quality as England has. Now, the problem comes at the expense of England still, because England has been so incredibly tied up with Britain that it is very hard to distinguish it and very hard to differentiate or define itself. And though this quote makes it seem as if it's super easy to do so, it's the Queen of England and they're talking English and it's an English gentleman, we'll see in the following that this is actually not as easy as he makes it out to be. And sort of this is what I'm going to do today, and I'm going to kind of run you through it, because what I want to investigate in this seminar, or very briefly in this session, is how do we come to this? How do we come to this weird confusion of what is Englishness and what is Britishness? How do we sort of end up in this indistinguishable mess, basically, that is Britain and England. And in order to untangle that, I have to go back to history. And for those of you that have taken one of my seminars before, you know that I'm very interested in history, although I've never studied it, but it is always very interesting to look at history in order to explain how certain states come into being on the one hand, and why, for instance, especially with Englishness and Britishness, these terms are so incredibly hard to define. So I'm just using one of the very bad quotes of Schuh des Manito, jetzt holt sich jeder noch ein Eis und dann reiten wir los. I can tell you already it's going to be a bit of a longish ride, so feel free to interrupt me with questions, because otherwise I'm going to talk for a very, very long time in this session. But again, there will be some fun, when we come to the end of the historic overview. All right. Let me have some tea, very British this morning, and then move on. So what we're basically starting off with, and what I'm starting off with, is what I've said numerous times, that the British identity or English identity is very much founded on the empire. This is one of the cornerstones of the British and English identity, in fact. So what we will start with is we're starting at the point where the empire starts, namely at home, in this case on the British Isles. And we're going to start with the Shiring of Wales. So this is also something you can't really see because my camera is in front of it. So this is the first part, which I have called the Shiring of Wales. And when we talk about Wales and England in particular, it's always a bit weird because generally we don't really think of Wales. Wales is kind of this tacked on neighbor of England, and it's kind of subsumed under England, and this has, this is particularly so the case because England and Wales have been merged and united for a very, very long time, namely since the 1500s roughly. So usually Wales is seen to be the first country that has ever felt the force of the English imperial conquest and project. And indeed, Wales as a political entity comes into existence as a junior partner in a Britain run by England. So Wales is incredibly or intimately tied up with Britain and England in this case. And I hope you can... There we go. So this is sort of the not the origin story of Wales, but yet again, it is the origin of how Wales comes to be a sort of, or becomes a political entity in a Britain run by England. Generally, Wales, or the people living in Wales, could be, and some have, mostly Christian Kumar has, for instance, called them the original British people. So these were the people that actually had claim on being British and being, originally British in this case. However, because of the English conquest, they were renamed. Usually they call themselves Cymry, which is means people of a common land or people of the same region. But Wales was renamed into Wales and the Welsh, and Wales is simply a Germanic word that is very demeaning because it means foreign or anything foreign. So basically the Welsh were made aliens in their own land, so to speak, by the English in this case. And I know I will confuse British and English in the following, so sorry for that. If I say British, I usually mean English. Again, this is sort of my own confusion that I have. One of the notable points about Wales was that Wales wasn't really united by this point. There had been sort of unification attempts. There had been attempts to create a unified kingdom of Wales, but all of these unification attempts never really went through, although there were pretty serious ones that established some kind of unity for a couple of years. And one of them was by Llywelyn the Great, who was one of the sort of last kings of Wales, who united most of the nobility in Wales. However, and he made his son, who was aptly named Llywelyn the Last, he made him the Prince of Wales. So this is also where this idea of the Prince of Wales sort of comes into being. However, again, this unification didn't really hold for very long and was very, very short-lived, because the nobles united together with Edward I, or united against Llywelyn with Edward I, and then eventually Wales was kind of not overrun, but it was certainly disabolished as a kingdom, and through the separation that Edward I sort of went through with in England, not in England, but in Wales. These first of all, those counties still exist nowadays, but mostly what happened was that the nobility was very firmly on the side of the English crown and of the English king, and what happens eventually is that England and Wales are being united in the Acts of Union. And I think I skipped quite a number of points. So we have let me just briefly go through. In the mid-13th century, we have these attempts of the United Kingdom of Wales. We have the invasion of Wales by Edward I in the 13th century, roughly. And eventually, I'm just going to click through. We have the Acts of Union in the in the 16th century, in 1536 and in 1543. Those are the Acts of Union between England and Wales. However, one of the most notable points in the unification attempts between England and Wales was, as the slide says, 1485, Henry Tudor becomes king, and Henry Tudor is a Welshman. So usually his sort of fight, or his win in the Battle of Bosworth, is seen as a Welsh win, because he also fights under the Red Dragon standard, which is at that point very, very rare. So one of the kings of England is actually a Welsh king on an English throne. And this is sort of a very, very short and very brief step-by-step history of how the Shiring of Wales actually works. It is very much a conquest. It is very much still an invasion. It is very much still some form of colonialism. But what it did was kind of superimpose a unified and a uniform pattern throughout the whole of Wales. So English laws, English norms, English common law, English justice were superimposed on the Welsh. Of course, helped by the sort of disunity of Wales, or the inner disunity of Wales in this case. Their relationship was very much characterized by animosity. So if you're being overrun by your next door neighbor, you of course don't really feel positively towards them. While the Welsh saw the English as colonializers, the English saw the Welsh as backwards, and even, went so far as to, based on prejudice, based on stereotypes, to prevent the Welsh language from being spoken for a very long time. So reclaiming the Welsh language, or reclaiming sort of the right to speak it, the right to use it, was one of the steps towards a very strong national and regional identity within Wales. So here we see again how language kind of features in this sort of nation-state, common blood kind of construction of national identities and regional identities. If we move on to the real first colonializing enterprise, that is the conquering of Ireland, we find a very, very similar situation. We don't find a very kind of and not similar situation to Wales. So how is it similar to Wales? It is similar to Wales because Ireland at that point was mostly small kingdoms, small dukedoms that eventually some of them, especially if they had conquered Dublin or if they resided in Dublin, could claim to be the High King of Ireland, but it wasn't really political unity. However, how it was different from Wales is that the Irish had never been conquered by anyone at that point, or at least not as fully conquered as, for instance, England by the Romans. So what they had was, they might not have had political unity, but they had a cultural unity. They had very strong cultural and collective identities, which was a common Irish identity. They had common myths, they had a common language, they had a very well-established and flourishing culture, they had very flourishing and established arts and religions, etc., or a religion, etc., etc. That separated it very much from Wales. However, the Irish also felt sort of I'm not quite sure what else. Yes. I didn't put anything on Ireland on the slides. Also good. So Ireland is obviously, in my book at least, not the most important part of this sort of creating of the First Empire. But anyways, we have the Act of Union, which I'll come to. But generally, Ireland was mostly not overrun, but it was simply fused into the English crown. So in 1171, I believe it is, we have Henry II, who kind of fuses the crowns and makes King John sort of the lord of over Ireland. And this lordship over Ireland persists basically until Henry VIII. So Ireland isn't really named as a separate entity. It is only under Henry VIII that the Irish are actually named as a separate part of this sort of the fusion of the crowns that makes Henry VIII also the King of England, Ireland, and Wales. And this establishing of Ireland is quite interesting because he claims not only lordship over it, but kingship over it. And this is a very different sort of way of framing it. Lordship has this, it could be seen as this sort of benign power, but kingship is certainly more absolutist, at least sort of, as I read it. And the justification of the colonializing of Ireland and the sort of the acts of union, as well as the not invasion, but kind of invasion, and the fusion of the crowns, was that the Irish, similarly to the Welsh, were seen as barbaric, they were seen as backwards, and they had to be sort of, I don't want to call it missionized, or they had to be civilized in a way. And this was, of course, something that the British had to do. So the Irish were basically the first ones to feel as Rudyard Kipling has so marvelously formulated, the white man's burden, or in this case, the Englishman's burden to civilize the rest of the world. Because, as we know, the rest of the world's never civilized, or not as civilized as England in this case. The problem is because of Ireland's position. So Wales is pretty much separated by Offa's Dyke, but is pretty close to England. Ireland, however, there is the channel in between. There is you have to cross water in order to get there. So it's pretty much separated from the rest of the British Isles, which is both good and not so good, because eventually Ireland couldn't be as integrated into the crown or into this entire sort of into the United Kingdom as much as Wales, for instance, simply because the English didn't have the same reach over Ireland that they had over Wales, for instance. So there has always been a separation between the English and the Irish, and this was never fully resolved, and could be potentially seen as partially one of the problems that we saw in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s with the sort of religious separation within Ireland and the conflicts within Ireland and between Ireland and sort of the rest of Britain. So while Ireland and England and Wales were unified during or through the Act of Union, or also with Scotland at that point, it was very much a not a very easy kind of union in this case. So Ireland is always kind of the odd one out. Talking about the odd one out, or the odd one in the north, we're right getting to Scotland. And Scotland is truly not a problem, but Scotland is certainly a special case in many regards. Because while we have the Shiring of Wales, which was an invasion, we have the conquering of Ireland, we have only a stealthily Anglicizing of Scotland. So Scotland is, of course, the infamous neighbor up north, and it wasn't as distinct as Ireland and Wales. So Ireland and Wales had very distinct regional identities, something that the Scottish didn't really have, because, they had that. It was the northern parts of Scotland, they definitely had very distinct regional identities. The Highlands were very distinct because they were very much cut off from the lowlands. So we have a separation within Scotland itself of the Highlands and the lowlands. And the lowlands in particular were actually pretty Norman. They had Norman laws, Anglo-Norman laws. They spoke French and Latin, so it was already very similar to their neighbor down south. But most importantly, they differentiated themselves from Ireland and Wales by their political unity. So they had something that neither Wales nor Ireland, though they had attempted it, had ever achieved, namely political unity within their country. And they were able to sort of use that political unity in order to remain largely independent from England in this case, and they were actually able to sort of set something against England in this case. So the Scottish kings of the 14th and 15th centuries freely made treaties, often anti-English treaties with foreign powers. The church was acknowledged as independent by the papacy, so that, for instance, the Great Schism, they took different sides from the English, or doing that. They had their own parliament, their own laws and law courts. Their writers exploited legends to construct a national history more venerable, more ancient, and more continuous than that of the English. So first of all, we have a clear sense of othering right here. So the Scottish, because they were so similar, they needed very clear-cut lines between them and the English. So what they did is they created their own history, their own myths and legends, etc., and used that in order to differentiate themselves from the English. They were, as I said, they were very similar to the English already. The Scottish kings, they were actually Norman kings. Their laws were modeled after the English laws, and the language that was spoken at court, for instance, was English and French, both, same thing as in England. So what can be said about the unification attempts was that the English didn't really conquer Scotland, although they might claim they did. But what they did is Scotland simply became more and more English over time, especially the lowlands where most of the economic, social and sort of cultural power rested in this case. And the Scottishness that we know, with bagpipes and kilts and so on and so forth, that was actually an invention that came much later, and something we'll get to in a moment, hopefully in a moment, if I don't ramble on too long in this case. So, and this Englishing of Scotland eventually leads to King James V of Scotland becoming King James I of England. And this is what history books usually call the Union of the Crowns. So it's in 1603, the crowns between of Scotland and of England are sort of merged. They are unified. It is a very tentative unification because at first it is only for economic purposes, and because James has claim to both thrones in this case. But James the First of England does a lot in order to properly, in a way, unify the two countries. So he lays the foundational the foundation stone, so to speak, for a unification or for an act of union in 1707, because he wanted to symbolically unify both countries. So what he came up with was, for instance, the Union flag, not to be confused with the Union Jack, a flag that he proposed would be used in all the colonializing attempts, for instance, during the colonial project of both Ireland, of both Scotland as well as Ireland, England and Wales. A flag that, to no surprise, offended most parties and didn't really go over too well. He also tried to sort of make the language more accessible as well as more standardized. But it wasn't until 1707 that this union or this act of union actually took place. And I think this is something that I did put on the slide, hopefully. Maybe that was... Nope, that's very slow today. This is not the quote I wanted to show you, so I didn't put that one on the slide. Very well prepared in this case. But yes, the Act of Union happens in 1707, and it is only up until or after that point that the Union Jack or the Union flag is being flown by the Navy, for instance, and that all those symbolic methods of creating a collective unity sort of also take place and sort of also work for the first time. So all in all, England sort of invades most of the British Isles in what Kumar has noted to be a fit of absence of mind. So they simply do that because they can. So England is in charge. And Kumar writes, if you're in charge, it is best not to remind others of this fact too often and too insistently, which is potentially very hard if you invade half of the world. But generally, this is what you ought to do. And this is exactly where we see one of the first problems sort of occurring when it comes to England. Because if you're in charge, which they were, and they weren't able to remind most people of it too often or too insistently, you can't really form a very strong identity, because then you would be reminding others of that fact. And if you're in charge, you need to be pretty much neutral. And this is exactly where England runs into a couple of problems, because they have a very long period of time where they didn't really have to define themselves, because England is always England, and it is England and Wales and Ireland and Scotland. It is never just England. It's never just Harry, so to speak. But it is an amalgamation of various people, of various cultures. And with each expansion, this problem becomes more dire, although the English at that point didn't really notice it. Because again, identity and national identities only are being put into question when you have moments of strife, when you have problems, when your identity is somehow under threat. And this is what happens with England at large during the most of the 20th century, which is the century where England tries to define itself because of the breakup of the empire. And I think there is one quote that I didn't put on the slide, but what says it quite nicely, because some people have sort of framed this as a jigsaw puzzle where a lot of pieces fit into one another. But what it actually is, Britain is far more of an abstract watercolor painting where colors run into one another, and where England sort of becomes this indistinguishable mess of cultures, of languages, of amalgamations, so to speak, of things that are part of England but are not specifically England as of this point. So Englishness and Britishness, or Britishness in this case, I'm talking about Britishness as the sort of state-nation identity that comes into being as a political and economical or economic necessity following these sorts of expansions by the English and the Union of the Crowns, for instance. So there is this idea that you need something, a cohesive identity to draw all of that together. And in order to legitimize the colonial enterprise, and in order to legitimize these unions, they sort of come up with the identity of the British, or with Britishness. And that is superimposed over very well-developed identities. So underneath all of that Britishness stuff, there is still Welshness, there's still Scottishness, there's still Irishness. But the question is, what is Englishness if Englishness, or if the English are in charge and aren't able to remind others of the fact? So first and foremost, Britishness and Britain is a political term, an economic term used for that. And it is used to reduce the alienation that others that are sort of subsumed under its heading might have felt during the colonial enterprise. So it is much better to say, it's a British enterprise than saying it's an English one, but the Scottish are helping. So by having this collective identity, the British were able to sort of have this collective identity, not to have the collective identity certainly, but to sort of legitimize their enterprises, to legitimize their invasion and expansions. Also during wars, you have this collective identity you can fall back on, because Britishness always also implies Scottishness. It always also kind of implies Irishness, because it is this umbrella term. And it is kind of this psychological feature of it. You provide them, you provide people with something they can hold on to, with something stable and cohesive, with a common history, etc., etc. And Britain provided sort of common markers that can be together used in order to celebrate it, in order to ritualize it, to perform them, to create very strong collective identities in this case. That doesn't mean that Britain didn't really exist before. So Britain was a term that the Romans had used in order to define the island they had landed on. and they used it as Britannia, which was then eventually, or still used nowadays in a way, but it was rarely used, and it is only under Henry VIII, who becomes King of Ireland, and under Edward VI, his son, that Britain becomes this political term that is actually being used in order, or in efforts to unite Scotland and England in this case. And as I said, James I is one of the driving forces behind this symbolic unification. So he calls himself the King of Great Britain, which is something. He doesn't call himself the King of England, Wales, Ireland, and Scotland, but he says it's Great Britain. So he is one of the first kings that actually sort of unifies it symbolically. He comes up with new flags and with the sort of the common British enterprise. And from then on, Britain becomes far more a stand-in, something to unite under. That is also being celebrated. So we did look at Rule Britannia. This is one of the more famous examples of celebrating and performing Britishness. But because it is such a political term, and because it rests on monarchy, and it rests on economic enterprises, in particular imperialism, empire and Britain, as well as monarchy, or empire and Britain, monarchy and Britain are very tightly fused together. Again, underneath, we have very strong regional identities. And this is what brings up the question of what about England in this case. So I said in the beginning that Britishness lacks the emotive quality because it lacks all kinds of pleasant connotations, sort of. However, England or Englishness does have and does evoke all kinds of pleasant connotations, as it evokes a people rather than a state. This is where we see the differentiation between nation states and state nation. England is a nation state, Britain is a state nation, something done for a particular purpose and having a particular function. Although it becomes more infused with emotive qualities, it remains some kind of umbrella term, some kind of very political entity. It evokes Blake's Jerusalem rather than Westminster. So Jerusalem is the anthem you heard last week in one of the first clips of the Olympic Games. It evokes Jerusalem rather than Westminster, Whitehall, or Balmoral. So Balmoral, Westminster, Whitehall are the seats for the political elite in this case. Because of its association with the language, it is tied to English literature. Because of its subliminal association with the countryside, the real England, it conjures up images of rusticity, chronicles of ancient sunlight. English is smaller and gentler than British. British is an altogether more uncomfortable term to work with, rather hard than soft, and belonging to a specific historical epoch rather than the timelessness of tradition. It is a political identity which derives its legitimacy from the expansion of the nation-state. Its associations are diplomatic and military rather than literary, imperial, rather, or as well as domestic. Compared with English, it is formal, abstract, and remote. So while Britishness really, really helps us to understand this as a pluralistic identity and to sort of unite pluralistic or plural identities and cultures underneath it, it is not really a folk culture. It's not really a folk identity, which is less open to outsiders. The folk identities are less open to outsiders, are far more clear-cut, and Britain isn't. It is very vague, it is very broad, and this is what makes it very hard to identify with, because it could connote a number of things, but nothing that is really, really separate. And Englishness is more closed off. It is more focused on a common heritage, on common literature and language, and, the law of the blood in this case, rather than the law of the soil. However, the British triumphs, the expansion in Ireland or the unification with Scotland, those were mostly English triumphs. The first colonies were English triumphs. They weren't really British ones. And this is sort of where this confusion or this flowing in together happens. So while and I still hope that's oh yes. I did put quotes on it that I will not be using. Just going to go just on the camera before I confuse everyone with the quotes that no one really needs to read. So basically, Britain's primary identity was an imperial one, and the English were firmly relegated to being one part of a whole. However, they were also the ones that ran the show. So Britain was ruled by London. The English did run most of the colonial enterprises. They were the first to expand, really. So England was mostly at the heart of Britain, and this remained the case for a very, very long period of time. If you only want to use the sort of in 1607, where they start the colonial enterprise in America, or if you want to use the Acts of Union, it is a very long history of England being at the center and at the heart of Britain. And it is only in times of crisis when the question of national identity arises. We saw that very much so in the entire debate on Brexit. Suddenly, people were far more English than they had ever been before, because Britain was nice, but England had to be protected. Britain had to be protected. And suddenly you have very strong regional identities, in particular the Scottish, that come up and say, you know what? We are still a separate entity. We might be subsumed under the heading of Britain, but we are still very strong individual countries. You have the devolution process, where power is redistributed to the separate countries in this case. You have the breaking up of the empire. Suddenly, you know, one of these cornerstones of Britishness and Englishness sort of breaks apart, with being really finished in 1997 with the handing back of Hong Kong. So all of these ideas that made up Englishness and Britishness suddenly fall away. And if Britain falls away, then what is England left with? Not a lot. So this is where we see things like Cool Britannia, or all these political movements that try to define Englishness. We see a resurging of patriotism and nationalism in a way, because there is this need to form this strong identity that you didn't really have before, or that you sort of lost in the process of being a ruling country in this case. So the breakup of the empire, all of the regional identities, the independence movements within the countries, the troubles in Ireland, etc., all of these things sort of lead to, together with multiculturalism as well as globalism or globalization, etc., they all lead to a renewed interest in the question of what is England and what is Englishness. And what has become clear during this process is that in some form, it is a very rural and rustic England that is being reused. So I think I said that last week, made a comment about why does England always look like the Shire? Because this is where people went back to. This is what people saw as the real England, namely an England that is very green with rolling hills, the driving force behind the industrialization, etc. So the essential England is seen to be a rural one. It is not an industrial one, although they do take pleasure in noting that they were the driving forces behind it, were economically strong, etc. But generally, industrialization is seen as this sort of ambivalent point, both as a problem and as an advantage. And this promotes a certain kind of England, a England that is very small term and it's very closed off. But this is, of course, a problem in this case, because this is not the England as it is right at the moment. And I'm just going to move back to this quote. So, framing Englishness as a pathological product of the United Kingdom's decline inclines politicians and citizens alike to perceive it as a regressive and insular form of identity, something I have described with Little Englandism, basically, that's very green, etc. A retreat from the dilemmas and challenges of the modern world and the wider entanglements and alliances to which England has belonged. Such a form of understanding suggests that this species of narrow nationalism needs to be contained and its potential impacts upon the working classes in particular negated through the cultivation of alternative ideas about universal rights and liberal values. So, when we frame Englishness, we shouldn't frame it too narrowly. So it's not just about patriotism, it's not just about nationalism, and it's not like this super strong nationalism, but certainly, and what Kenny in this case sort of leaves out of it, is that the English have a truly identity problem. They are currently more or less in an identity crisis because all of the cornerstones that they built their identities on, they have broken away. So England is kind of left with not much, at least. So this is why we see these kinds of, like the Olympic Games or all these films on the Great War, for instance, or why we see a resurgence of heritage films, of alternative heritage films currently, because they try to answer the same question: what is England and who is England and who are we going to be and who we want to be? So this is also why, for instance, some of the modern heritage films are very critical of imperialism and colonialism, and they try to frame it now very differently or try to engage with it critically. And this is sort of the field of negotiation and the field of problematization of England and Britain, where heritage films, again, become one of the not driving features, but certainly one of the more important features. And I hope I have that quote on it. And again, this is why heritage is important, why traditions are important, why cultural memory is so vital, because heritage prepared the way for, or could be thought as giving expression to, a recrudescence of Little Englandism. This is, if you think of most of the Jane Austen films, it's very pleasant, it's very nice, very green, very small time, a very small term also, and the revival of nationalism as a force in political life. And it anticipated and gave expression to the triumph of Thatcherism in the sphere of high politics. So it's a very conservative medium and a very conservative look at England. Heritage, in short, was a symbol of national decadence, a malignant growth which testified at once to the strength of this country's ancient regime and to the weaknesses of radical alternatives to it. So this is sort of in 1994, where we're sort of coming off from this sort of high point of heritage cinema. So heritage cinema is very firmly located in the 1980s and the early 90s, and we're just coming off from the first wave of heritage cinema, basically, that portrayed England as very conservative, upper class, aristocratic, very ideologically conservative in its gender views, for instance, etc., etc. So this is where we kind of start off with. Before I go on to talk about heritage cinema, I do have one question, and that is, do you have any questions so far? Is there anything you want to have explained in more detail? Is there anything where you think, that didn't really make sense? Could you just go back to it? Anything at all I ought to not question, but talk about again? Or anything else, anything you found interesting and want to know more about? I'm also up for that. I just drink my tea while I wait. The dinosaur on the shelf is staring into your soul. Oh yes, it actually is pretty nice. A friend of mine made it for me, gave it to me on my birthday, and it has a little cloak, like a wizard's cloak and a little wizard's head, and also Harry Potter glasses. And I can change it. I think it also has a different uniform, like a Navy uniform, because I'm unsurprisingly really into the Navy. For a second I wanted to say I'm really into uniforms, but that would have sounded very weird. Okay, so yes, there's always something going on behind me, which is definitely more interesting than me standing in front of you in a very plain room at Wiener Straße. We need to see it up close, obviously. I'm not going to get up and get the dinosaur. If you could skip back to the heritage quote, I would like to check if I understood it correctly. Sure thing, I can. I already jumped forward. Good God. Oops. Before you see me switching around manically, I'm going to simply do it like this and not go back to that. So now you have to wait. I mean, I could also potentially... animations. Why do I use them? Because they look nice, but they are also make it very hard. And while you check the quote. I hope you can actually see it. No, you can't. Not yet anyways. But in a moment. Namely, now. That's the quote. Oh right, I forgot. It's a live stream, right? You can skip back and forth. I very briefly forgot, and for those of you who wanted to see that weird little dinosaur, this is the one. He's even wearing a Slytherin scarf. I'm not quite sure why I got up and showed you this dinosaur. I think a couple of semesters ago, I had a naked Ken doll hanging from this lamp, and everyone was kind of like, what? Why is that in the background? The reason was because my partner had put it there because we didn't know where to put it in, during cleaning up, and we put it there. So that was weird. Anyways, there's always something weird kind of in the background, and I'm just going to put the dinosaur back. All right, and we're going to go back to the quote about heritage. Okay, so much better teaching from home, right? Okay, so there seems to be no other questions apart from my questionable interior decorating skills, which is why I'm going to move on to the second part of this session, that is indeed this case heritage cinema. So let me just check my notes and do that. So one of the first questions we need to kind of deal with is the question of how do we actually sort of get to the point that we see England as being completely only defined as green and pleasant. So if you, just to kind of sum up and to kind of check if we're on the same page, where would you say do these things stem from, or how can these images be established? If you look at identity, national identity, and everything we've done so far. I could also just kind of go on, really, which I'm going to do. So just to kind of sum up all of these things. So, of course, we have things like heritage cinema. We have things like cinema, television, heritage sites, Olympic Games, ritual performances of national identity. Generally, however, these images are being located in something. Or basically, it's a question, sorry, just need to kind of get back into the flow in this case. But generally, it is interesting that we see England always as pleasant, as nice, as green, etc., etc. But what we don't see is basically the condition of the working class that Engels writes about. We don't see Cottonopolis, we don't see Manchester, we don't see the urban centres, unless it's London, of course, or unless the urban centres are very small and nice and clean. We don't see something like, for instance, train spotting. We don't have an English train spotting at that point. So some of the more famous films, some of the more famous performances of national identity, they are very, very positive. They are definitely not the slums and the condition of the working class in England kind of things. So we have certain national symbols that are always being used, whether it's the landscape that has become one of the national symbols, or whether it's sort of flags, or whether it's Britannia that is being used and that is being shown in public places. So we have an everyday performance of national identity. And these national performances are very, very much codified. So usually nations, and I think I've mentioned that already, they are described as garden cultures. They're tended, they're cultivated, they're codified, they're surveyed by but usually by professionals or by people that have special interests in them, by specialists in general. So institutions, filmmakers, authorities, institutions meaning, for instance, the BBC is one of these social institutions, filmmakers, etc. They become these specialists that tend to cultures, and they try to stabilize and to codify and to routinize these performances. And the setup, the codification, and the routinization, the repetition of performances is very important. This is also when we come to films. This is where it gets important, but because what is a film if not a potential for, infinite amounts of repetitions? And these these performances of national culture, whether it's the Union Jack flying from one of the buildings, or whether it's singing the anthem, or whether it's saying "God Save the Queen," or whether it's another reference to the monarchy, etc., etc., or whether it's even wearing a poppy flower on the 5th of November. All of these things constitute national performances, and they are very much integrated in everyday life. And indeed, they have to be, in a way, in order to be profound ways, because power, national power, is always distributed to the smallest elements of a nation. So it's what Foucault calls a capillary of power. So all the small elements, all the everyday moments where nations are being performed are important in order to legitimize the power of a national identity, for instance. And where do we get those images from? Well, these images have become, because they are or have been used for so long, they have become part of what is called a cultural memory. And this is exactly where those iconographies are basically being stored. And this is not what we see, but this is now you have seen a spoiler of what is to come in this case. But this is basically where we see that England is a green and pleasant land. This is the iconography that is being stored in the cultural memory. And this is a concept based on Jan Assmann's writings. He writes extensively on the question of collective memory, and he basically notes that memory is made out of three parts. On the one hand, you have individual memory. This is, what did I have for breakfast? What did I do yesterday? When's my mother's birthday? These are individual memory questions. This is something that happens on a very small scale level, on your level, and that is kind of limited. You cannot think back to something that came before a certain point in time, for instance. You can't really remember everything. It's very limited to the lifespan of you yourself or of the individual. Then there is collective memory. Collective memory basically means that what a collective, a certain generation or a certain part of a generation thinks. So collective memory, the Second World War is, for instance, still a collective memory because there are still people alive that were alive during the Second World War, that experienced the Second World War. So they, because they are still alive, because their individual memory is still part of our collective, it is part of a collective memory. So collective memory is partially historical, but it doesn't reach back as far as, for instance, cultural memory. Cultural memory is also to do with history, but it reaches back to everything that has sort of established the nation. Cultural memory is, in the UK sense, would be the Battle of Trafalgar. No one's still alive who experienced that, but the Battle of Trafalgar, the Battle of Bosworth, these are still, the Battle of Hastings, whatever, the Magna Carta, these are still parts of a cultural memory. So the Magna Carta that we had in the beginning and the importance of the Magna Carta, this is part of a cultural memory. And I'm just wondering whether I'm actually in focus. Sometimes that camera does weird things. Anyways, I'm getting sidetracked. So this is cultural memory, something that spans the entire lifespan of a nation. And cultural memory is very much selective. So while usually we confuse cultural memory also a bit with history, but history is something verifiable. We have accounts, we have monuments, we have a number of documents with which we can verify that certain events happens. They are not always reliable, but generally it's verifiable. It's not truth, but it's certainly memory supported by documents. However, cultural memory is not verifiable. Not necessarily, because memory is history seen through effect. History is, however, memory that is being supported by reliable documents. And memory is basically the other point around. They are very much tied together, but memory is even less reliable than history because it is far more selective. That doesn't mean that historiography isn't selective, by no means. But generally, memory involves questions of emotions, of importance, national importance. These things do play a role when it comes to that. And that does not to the same extent play a role when it comes to history. So let me just go through my slides, which I have. That is not the right way of putting them in order, which is why I'm going to do it like that. Yeah. So that should work. It doesn't, because it always switches back to the wrong. All right, so green and pleasant land, we had that already. So what cultural memory is it is basically a form or a kind of an institution. It is exteriorized, it is objectified, it is stored away in symbolic forms that, unlike the sound of words or the sight of gestures, are stable and situation transcendent. They may be transferred from one situation to another, and they may be transmitted from one generation to another. So cultural memory, if we go back to the question of poppies and wearing poppies on the 5th of November, this is, for instance, one of these traditions that is, or a commemorative aspect or a memory that is exteriorized in the form of a poppy flower. It is objectified, or in this case, because it is performed, it is worn outside, is objectified in the sense of it is this flower has become a symbol for the Great War, and it is stored away in symbolic forms that, unlike etc., are stable and situation transcendent. So the poppy flower has been in place since the 1920s, and I'm not sure whether it will ever be done away with, because it has become part of a cultural memory, and it has become part of sort of the cultural memory of a nation, of the collective memory of a nation. So these kinds of objects and these kinds of symbolic forms, they need to be, as national identity, need to be performed. They need to be exteriorized, objectified, and stored away. And this is done mostly through a certain kind of transference, through institutions of preservance and interpretation. So institutions of learning and presentation and preservation. So schools are very important, because especially when we look at history is always kind of infused with this sort of cultural memory aspect. So education is an important part of teaching a nation to a nation. That is one part. Also museums, libraries, etc. These are very important institutions in order to store parts of cultural memory and in order to transmit and preserve and interpret them. So it is very much a question of how are objects sort of put in a certain order. And we'll look at an example in a moment. But generally, for instance, a couple of weeks ago, I was at London, and a lot of people go to the British Library to see one of the copies or the documents of the Magna Carta, and it is displayed quite prominently in a way. So this tells us something about the inherent importance of this document. It is displayed prominently, it is displayed in a glass case, it is lit up, it is very, very significant, not only for the nation, but also for this library. And it is stored and preserved and interpreted in the context of this library. So what we're going to look at in the following is, and I hope it is actually that, exactly, it is this. Again, we're talking about cultural memory, we're talking about the question of preservance and interpretation, and my question to you is, what is this? What do you see on these two pictures? Or what is notable about the presentation of these things? I'm actually interested to know whether anyone kind of immediately knows what it is. It looks like an old uniform worn by a soldier. Yep, all right. It is an old uniform. No surprise there. Yeah. What else? What about the others? Not bad. It's a Navy uniform, yes. Any idea what kind of Navy uniform? It's one of high rank, yes. It's a Marine uniform, absolutely. Which rank? Anyone taking an educated guess right here? It is displayed in front of the Union Jack, yes. Very good. It's an admiral's uniform. It's a rear admiral's uniform in this case. But yes, absolutely. It's a very high rank. It's the second highest rank in the Royal Navy. Okay, so we see an admiral's uniform being displayed in front of a Union Jack. What does that tell us about the Navy? What does that tell us about the person who wore it? Anyone wants to take a guess whose uniform that might be? Perhaps? Okay, at least one person kind of has an idea. Yes, indeed, it is Admiral Nelson's uniform. In fact, it is the uniform he wore during the Battle of Trafalgar when he was shot by a sniper from a neighboring ship. So this is Admiral Nelson's uniform, usually very well or very easy to identify because Nelson lost his arm, I think, in the Battle of the Nile. I'm not making a joke about battle and denial, but generally he lost his arm, I think, in the Battle of the Nile, and he always had it like Napoleon, basically tucked into the side of his uniform. It is very correct. He was an admiral. You can also see, especially on the right-hand picture, you can't see my cursor in this case, but generally you can see his orders of chivalry, basically on his breast. And he is, or this uniform is, and usually, because this is something one of the pictures I took myself, you kind of walk into a very long-ish room and you walk right in between kind of the history of the Battle of Trafalgar, and right in the middle of it, you walk right towards it, is this display case with Nelson's uniform right in that. No, Napoleon didn't lose an arm, but he usually had kind of, you can't see it because I'm too small in this case, but he always had his arm or his hand tucked into his jacket, and this is something that Nelson also did, not because of Napoleon, he fought Napoleon, but generally because of his loss of his arm. So it was just it's this weirdly Napoleonic gesture. Anyways, so no, Napoleon didn't lose his arm, but Nelson did. So no problem. Okay, so, and you walk towards this one single display case of Nelson's uniform, and not just any uniform, but his undress uniform. Usually when you were in battle as an admiral or as a rear admiral, you were asked to wear not really a battle uniform, but usually a dress uniform, something that made you, that showed your rank. But Nelson did not wear his dress uniform. He wore his undress uniform, which is a simpler way and has much less gold basically on it. But again, you walk into this museum and you have this long way towards Nelson's uniform. And in the background, as you've so rightly spotted, is the Union Jack. It is one of the flags that was flown or presumably flown throughout the Battle of Trafalgar, not on Nelson's ship, but on another ship. Also, on the left-hand picture, you can see right on the right-hand side, you can see the base of the statue on Trafalgar Square. So this is a display that is very much about the Battle of Trafalgar, but as the sort of the main position of this uniform shows, it is not just about the Battle of Trafalgar, it is mostly about Lord Nelson and about his death and about his funeral. Not so much really about his life. They have a couple of things about the Battle of the Nile and his battles and how he lost his arm and how he writes to one of his or to his mistress in a way, how he suffers from that, etc., etc. You do have that, but generally this display is mostly about the death of Nelson. So what you see, and this is a comparison piece, as I said, the exhibition has changed. Formerly, this uniform was displayed as a part of maritime London, and it was called London's Hero. You had a very small display on Nelson's uniform. It's still much in the center, but generally it was mostly about his funeral and about the objects of memoir, basically, that came out of this funeral, like the rings and the cutlery and the plates and whatnot. So all the commemoration questions. And this is very different. It is, in this case, Nelson and the Battle of Trafalgar, they were part of a greater whole. But in this case, or in the new exhibition, this is not so much the case any longer. Again, on his uniform, you can see the orders, and there, after he was shot, so he didn't die immediately, he actually told one of his captains that he knew that he was dying because he could feel that the bullet was lodged in his spine, and he knew that he was dying, and he was taken under deck and treated, and they tried to save him, but they knew that that this wouldn't be possible. So one of the first things that came out of the Battle of Trafalgar, apart from hey, it was won, was that Nelson was actually shot through his order. So the Order of Chivalry, which is right across his heart, that was what people presumed him to be shot through. And there was this sort of legend or this myth that came up that he was shot through his honor. So the quote in the beginning where England expects every man to do his duty. This is something that Nelson said in order to begin the Battle of Trafalgar, or has allegedly said in order to begin it. So this is something contributed or attributed to Nelson. And this idea that he was shot through his honor was, of course, England was shot through her heart. He became a symbol for England. Other people, mostly his critics, said that he had his orders sort of on his jacket. He was easily spottable from the other ships. So it was no huge problem for the sniper to actually point towards Nelson and shoot him. However, as you can see from the orders, they are pretty much intact. So this idea that he was shot through the orders is actually just that. It is a myth. It has no basis in real life because he was actually shot through the shoulder. And these are, of course, close-ups from this uniform. They also have on the display cases, it says, the blood stains you see are still Nelson's blood stains. And there's also a stocking where you have blood on it. So it's kind of gory, which I really like. But it is also kind of, also a weird thing to say. But generally, it is also very, very much, I don't know, exciting and sort of put as this super exciting thing to have, and we have traced it all, and we have sort of kept his uniform, which I always find a bit weird. But generally, going back to the myth and the legend creating of Nelson, not only his quotes, but that he was shot through his orders, these have been pervasive ideas. And though we have proof that that wasn't the case, these legends have still proliferated. There are still talks being done about, taking apart Nelson's uniform, and was he shot, and how he was shot, and was it actually, and so on and so forth. So Nelson is still a symbol for England, a symbol for one of England's triumphs, one of the, well, not last triumphs, but one of the greatest triumphs, the Battle of Trafalgar. He is a Navy man. The Navy is very important in the national identification process of England and Britain. So Nelson is still at the forefront, and whatever comes out of these, as verifiable truth, that doesn't matter, because the image and the memory created right around Nelson has already established him. And this sort of memory involves forgetting. It involves forgetting that he was actually shot through the shoulder, that you could see the orders, but you can't see them as plainly in a battlefield, especially a ship battle with cannon smoke and people running around. It's pretty hard to still figure out who is who there. So there have been these stories around Nelson that have sort of focused on very specific parts, either on his vanity or on his heroic death or on his last words, which were apparently, now kiss me hardy and now I can die in peace. So there are different readings of Nelson, but all of these readings involve a systematic forgetting of certain parts of Nelson's story, of certain parts of the Battle of Trafalgar. And this is where we see one of the main functions of cultural memory. That is, memory always involves not symbolic, but systematic forgetting. In order to be able to perform an identity function, it is very much important to forget that if you, for instance, look at Nelson from a purely queer reading, if we want to read Nelson as a queer person, then we would have to forget that he had a mistress, that he was married, that he was obviously, well, I'm saying obviously, I'm saying that in inverted commas, that he was a straight man. But this is something that can be forgotten, can be left out in order to read an idealized image of a certain person. That's maybe not a good example, but this is one of the processes that goes on when it comes to cultural memory. It involves systematic forgetting of things that do not fit your identity, that do not fit your idea of a nation, for instance. And this is also where performance comes back. In this case, it's not only important to put it in a certain place, to link it with other certain fragments, link it with the Union Jack. They could have just had a black board right behind it, but no, they put the Union Jack behind it, or behind this uniform. They portrayed the uniform itself. They didn't just put a picture on it, or they didn't just display something else, but they did use that particular uniform. These are systematic choices that define very much how we read this. Coming in this room, you know immediately that this uniform is the key point of this exhibition. It is not the Union Jack. It is not the statue on Trafalgar Square. It is this uniform, and you know it exactly because it is put in the center of this exhibition. And this is exactly what I meant with preservance and interpretation. Preservance, they're preserving these cultural artifacts, these historical artifacts. That's brilliant. But they also interpret that in a certain way by putting it in a certain place, by linking it to certain other fragments. And this is an interpretation that sort of creates Nelson as this national hero, not any longer as the former exhibition says, as one part of maritime London and London's hero, but as the national hero of the Battle of Trafalgar. No one else really matters. It's not Hardy, it's not the sniper of the Redoutable. It is definitely Nelson who matters, who is the key and angle point of this battle and of this key cultural moment and this key moment of cultural memory in this case. And in a way, museums do preserve, they do interpret, but they are also part of a performance. They do teach the nation to the nation. So they're also educational, in fact, in some form. And performances, and we do rarely see films being made about Nelson and the Battle of Trafalgar, but we see films being made about the Navy. We see films being made about other key cultural or key historic moments in time, and these performances are incredibly vital because performances continually help to constitute and reconstitute meaning. By moving this display case from one place to the other, they do change the meaning, not the meeting. They probably also change a couple of meetings, but they change the meaning in a way. So what they still do is they constitute Nelson as the centerpiece of the Battle of Trafalgar. That doesn't change, but they reconstitute other meanings. It is not so much London's hero, but Britain's hero. That is a reconstitution of meanings. And these identities, or the national identity in this case, is rehearsed and then transmitted. This is the point where performances are actually important because these things are cohesive, like a theater performance mostly. They use certain props, they use certain stages, they use certain symbols, but all of them are rehearsed in order to function in a cohesive and stable manner. And performances, whether it's a museum or whether it's the Olympic Games, they all constitute a collective form of remembering and forgetting. So the Olympic Games continuously, or this opening continuously forgot slavery, but they definitely remembered that, you know, England was green, that cricket was being played. These things were remembered, but other things were forgotten. It was also forgotten that England during that time of the industrialization was mostly white and was kind of built on the backs of the working class. This is something it continuously and systematically kind of forgot by making it more or less a colorblind performance. And as can be seen in the national or in the Olympic Games, these performances are very much, they are staged, they are scripted, they are choreographed. And the more important these performances and these key cultural moments are, the more tightly choreographed and scripted these performances are. So in terms of the Olympic Games, with the entire world watching, they don't have any leeway. There is no room for improvising. There is no way they can change certain aspects. There is no way they can suddenly use the Union flag instead of the Union Jack, or just kind of use a different flag. So this is not possible any longer, because they have very strict functions, and they have very strict forms of showing certain things and of staging certain things. And this is where I'm kind of moving on to a different example of cultural memory, which where it becomes actually pretty or very much clear how much of these performances is actually not scripted, but also invented. So we're going to go through that in a moment. Just give me a sec to switch, and then we can move on. So maybe as I switch these things around, if you think of Scottishness, what do you think of? What is the first thing that pops to your mind when you hear Scotland, Scottishness, and Scotsmen? Okay. Bagpipes. Yes, who doesn't think of that? What else? And we're talking Gordon Ramsay. Okay. Fair enough. Okay. Play kilts. Okay, yeah. Maybe in comparison to England, anything nature-wise that sort of comes up, or that makes it very different from the rest. An accent which sounds funny to me. Castles, actually, yeah. Awkward castle, which I always like because it sounds like awkward and not so much like it's written anyways. An accent which sounds funny. It does sound a bit funny, really. Okay, what else? Okay. Or anything else that we haven't really covered? So maybe to kind of sum up what we usually think of when we... Many lakes. Yes, absolutely. Peter Capaldi. Perfectly. Sheep. All right. I mean, I could make a very, very bad joke about sheep and Wales, and I'm going to make it because I find it funny. And I can't see whether you laugh or whether you don't, so I'm going to make that joke. So what's a sheep tied to a pole in Wales? And the answer is, of course, a leisure centre. Anyways, so we have Nessie, yes, we have the Loch Ness Monster, we have mountain sheep, etc. So what we have is a very stereotypical idea of Scotland, mostly focused on the Highlands, very wild, very rough, etc., etc. And I just saw the time. We still have 2 minutes left. So what I'm going to start off with is by introducing you to one of the more interesting performances of Scottishness that we have had in the last couple of years. And you have already seen it in parts. That is the movie, of course. The movie Brave of 2012. And this is exactly what we're going to sort of start off with next week. but not this week, because this week we're already kind of right on time. So this is something we're going to be dealing with next week, same place, same time, hopefully in person and not, broadcast from home in this case, but when I can actually talk to you again and not just sit here and wait for someone to type. So there's that. But for those of you that were here, for those of you that watched it, and for those of you that will watch it eventually, and for those of you that actually engaged with me in the chat, thank you very much for your participation. It was good to have you here. Thank you for listening to me ramble on about history and about cultural memory and about the Navy, which is one of my favorite topics. And I'm going to see you next week, same place, same time. Have a good week and see you later.